For anyone who was looking forward to what we were colloquially referring to as the MISP bullshit session, that's going to start somewhere around 4:30, 4:35 if I had to guess, and we will be using this projector. There is no time limit today like there was yesterday, so that's just going to go until we're all tired of talking about it. So that'll work. As it is, I'm going to go in the back and start herding people back into seats and see if I can get it quiet again, and then we will kick off our next talk here.
Good morning, everyone. Did anyone manage to see the eclipse this morning, by the way? Did I miss anything? Because I was applying some last-minute touch-ups to my slides with the blinds closed, and I realized I completely missed it. So today we're going to talk about reducing the effectiveness of common attacks on workstations while preserving user experience for typical workstations. We're not going to talk about servers. We're not going to talk about really specific threat models. So my name is Guillaume. I'm a blue team manager for a large tech company. Yes, my username is usually gross. I get that pretty often. It's great. People don't forget your email address. I'll love more email. So I started my career working in IT. I didn't even know security was really a thing that could be a full-time job back then. I just thought, I work in a bank. The sysadmins must be great at security. You know, else they wouldn't work in a bank, obviously. So I was introduced to security through IT projects, right? Like always the one making sure things were done in a secure way with whatever different systems. And because of that, I'm still really interested in how we roll out different IT projects and so on in a secure way. I've done a few years of security consulting, and I decided I wanted to be doing more of what I was telling the other people to do, which gave me the opportunity of measuring some of these things that I've been talking about to see how effective they were for real. So the first thing I want to do is I want to go back in time. 2016, I was working at Rapid7 in their strategic services team, and with one of my colleagues, Jordan Rogers, I did a talk where we took a bunch of different attacks that we saw in the incident response team at Rapid7. We look at the different ways people broke in, moved laterally, and so on, and then we just try to find out what would have been the most effective way to prevent those attacks, either from landing on systems or from spreading pretty quickly. And it turned out, it was really rare that the answer to anything was, you should have bought more stuff. It was almost never that. The answer was never, more blockchains, more machine learning, or anything else. It was usually related to security configuration. So what we done was we built a fake attack based on real events, right? And then we were showing it in reverse. So I won't go through all of it, but basically the idea was we were showing how lateral movement was working and what you should do to prevent that and so on. And showing a timeline where over a few hours the attackers moved from a workstation, got domain admin, and proceeded to get whatever they were trying to get. And it started with everything is fine, we're not going to get hacked, other people get hacked, and so on. And then we told people, in 2016, 2017, just grab more shovels, stop trying to believe in this silver bullets. And I think those are my biggest famous last words I've ever said, right? So I said that just before taking a job leading a blue team. So who else remembers what happened on June 27th this summer? All right, you can look it up. So the issue with hardening is it's often pretty complex, right? There's a lot of different settings, and there's a lot of settings that just don't matter that much. The end user experience sometimes suffers from it. So who's ever had a computer provided to them by a company where it's just so unusable, you want to run to Best Buy and buy like a cheap laptop to do your work on, right? So you want to avoid that. But the default settings on a lot of stuff aren't good enough. But the thing is, you look at typical hardening, and I got two examples here. The text is really small, but if you look at the CIS benchmark for Windows, for example, so who thinks the CIS benchmark for Windows is more than 100 pages long in PDF? It's over 1,000 pages long, right? That's how many settings they have in there. And to be fair, they separate things between different levels for different threat models, but what you have on the left here is they're telling you to disable some services related to Bluetooth, which if your threat model is physical proximity to someone who's trying to break into your system, maybe in a lab or something really high security, that makes sense. But for me, for my accounting department, I'm way more worried about other stuff. Then they have this recommendation where they say, oh, you should be preventing local accounts on Windows from logging in remotely, which is something that's available on Windows 7 and up and has been for a few years. That is actually massively useful, and I felt like it was probably massively useful It's just when you tell people to do it, you can't necessarily measure it. And then you've got like the typical stuff that people just do for compliance, right? Ensure you have a remote login banner, right? Like every hardening project I'd ever worked on, people would argue about the login banner for days. It's like, why, right? Like, please, no ransomware. Like, it won't stop attacks, right? Like, just put it there, get it moving, just check the box and move to something else. So I was wondering, what's the minimum amount of stuff that I can do that's going to have the biggest impact? And is there any way I can make these workstations work better for the end users at the same time? So what we're going to look at is how we can roll out stuff like that without setting stuff on fire accidentally, because I think it's really important to keep your credibility when you're changing how systems work for end users. If you go too fast, break too much stuff, it's gonna hurt in the long run. We're going to look at a few specific settings. It's going to be mostly Windows focused, though pretty much everything I'm saying applies to other operating systems as well. And then I have some aggregated data that I can share on things like amount of detections on hardened versus not hardened systems and so on. So does anyone have their buzzword bingo card yet? Because I'm about to say attack kill chain. So this is just a screenshot from Microsoft's kill chain. And obviously it's really Windows oriented. You can see the end state of their attack is the attacker gets domain admin credentials. That's not actually what anyone who's attacking you wants. That's how they're going to get what they want. But if I started looking at this and I figured external recon is probably not related that much to the workstations, but compromised machine, the internal recon, privilege escalation, gathering credentials, and so on. That's definitely something that we can improve, right? So I looked at existing environments that I had, and I gathered some stats on things like off-the-shelf malware detections and PUPs, potentially unwanted programs, which is just a way of saying it's malware, but don't sue me because I didn't say it's malware. Low-quality signature hits, right? You know, everything that hits on any website that you go to and there's like a weird tracking cookie or whatever just generates noise. Can we kill that noise? End-user backdoors, that's what I call the well-intentioned IT guy who's trying to reset the local admin password on a machine by using sticky keys, right? Like that looks terribly bad. When you work in a SOC, you see, holy shit, someone has replaced sticky keys with cmd.exe and just ran it. So that's bad for my heart. So I wanted to limit that. And then suspicious behavior detections like lateral movement attempts, people using like NetGroup on an accounting machine where it's never been run, and so on. So on the environment where I roll this out first, you have like two really chunky types of detections. One is malware, and the other one is the rest. And the rest is usually malware, but detected a different way, like suspicious DNS traffic and so on that you could tie to malware. Everything else is like suspicious admin tools and people messing with sticky keys and all of that. It's higher criticality, but it's a much smaller volume. And I threw in a pie chart in there just to annoy people who hate pie charts. So the first step is you really want to pick a user population to get started. You want to start with the users that are more at risk sometimes because you want to reduce the risk, but ideally with people that do more standardized types of work. So for example, if you have Linux developers that use Windows 10, they install Ubuntu on Windows 10 and they use Docker on it, like don't start with that. It's not worth the trouble. Do that later. You need to do it to your own team, right? Like the security team for your day-to-day workstation should be at least as hardened as what you're forcing your end users to do. Otherwise, right, like it's easy to tell people, no, you can't do this, can't do that. You have to be able to live with it, says the guy who's using a Mac in a Windows company. But you need to build an exception process and just be very liberal with exceptions early on. I find that if you can go fast and do these things on 90% of your machines, then you can worry about the exceptions. So don't worry about it too much when you need to do some exceptions. So in my case, the interns were a really, really interesting user population to get started on because they show up at work on the same day, right? Like in just our Montreal office, we'll have 40, 45, sometimes 50 interns starting on the same day. So they all get their workstation. Oh, what do you use? Oh, I use Notepad++. Can you try to install that? And like the word gets around. So it's an interesting population to target first because they have some pretty risky behaviors. And we knew that they actually generated more different types of alerts for, not super advanced stuff, just, the kind of garbage ad tracking networks with bad cookies and different things like that. So that was a really good user population. So if we went back to that attack kill chain, well, I figured that if we just focused on Windows, Edge, Chrome, preventing lateral movement, saving ourselves from Java, hardening Office a little bit, and reducing the amount of local admin that are used day to day, it would probably have a pretty massive impact on most of the steps of that kill chain. So we're going to look at a few different settings, but first I really want to talk about how you're going to roll that out. So granularity is the key. So most big hardening projects that I've seen fail is because you try to do like a one-size-fits-all, and you don't think about the exceptions in advance. So you can be using GPOs, DC, like whatever you're using. You want to break it down so you can manage exceptions really easily and granularly. So for example, you probably have a policy at work that says your screen needs to get locked after 15 minutes of inactivity. Whoever designed that, you know there's like a kiosk machine somewhere that can't have a screensaver, right? Like it's obvious from the minute you say you need to do that, you should already have that exception ready. So the best way I found to do that was to be mildly granular with groups of settings that you roll out. So what that's going to let you do is, for example, if you have a policy for hardening the operating system, you have one for Chrome, you have one for IE, and so on, you don't end up with 25 different policies. You end up with maybe a dozen. But it makes it really easy to communicate to your end users, okay, this week this is happening. Starting next week, you won't be able to execute macros downloaded from the internet and so on. So you want to break it like that. And you want to do the same thing for Chrome, and then for everything, you'll probably do user hardening versus machine hardening. And nested groups are your friends. Sometimes are also your enemies when they get out of hand, but you really want to do it in a way where, depending on the tools that you're using, the easiest approach I found to rolling this out was you create your different settings, you filter it out so no one actually receives them in the beginning, right? I picked my user population, these interns, and then what you do is you start adding people to the hardened group, but then you start making the hardened group more hardened. So effectively, let's say you're trying to apply this to 1,000 people, you do 100 a week. The first 100, it changes nothing when you put them in that group. It changes nothing at all. After 1 week, you roll out the hardening for Microsoft Office. After 2 weeks, you roll out the hardening for say Chrome. 3 weeks you do Windows. So what happens is the people that get in that group early on, it's less jarring. They can know in advance what's going to change in their workflows. And the people that get in later, they get more changes applied to their machine at once, but it's been tested by all these other people that have been there for a few weeks. So you can just have like a nice member of group. You got a group that says user hardening that's member of Chrome hardened users and so on. I mean, you can figure it out. That's not too complicated. And then the idea is really, constantly be adding machines to that and then make that group more hardened. And one key thing that I found was you need to have some visual indicator for end users. You can't just like tell them and then they'll forget, because if something is broken and they just need an exception, nothing is worse for someone to be troubleshooting for 3 hours to realize that, oh, the feature just got disabled on me. So if we go back to our typical hardening that says you should have a banner, well, why don't we use that banner to tell the users what hardening version they're running on, right? And you should probably pick a name for it or have a version number or a year or something like that. That way, some companies, they push data to the background on some workstations, whatever. Make it easy for someone who calls IT to be able to say, oh, I'm running the 2018 Q1 hardening or whatever. Then you build your schedule and you roll it out. So now we're going to get into some specific settings. So for pretty much all I'm going to talk about, I would say like, yeah, the basic hardening, the guidelines from the vendors and so on, they do apply. But in many cases, they'll help you once someone has broken in. They won't necessarily help you prevent the malware from landing. So for example, if you're using NTLM, that's a really, really bad idea. But unlike using an old version of Java in Internet Explorer, that's not going to get the code execution first. So most of my settings are biased towards preventing that execution up front, because one of my goals was to reduce the noise so we can focus on the more interesting stuff later on. So for Windows 10, for that environment, we just took the standard Microsoft stuff and then we focus on a few very specific things. Windows Firewall, 445, block it from everything except for whitelisted management systems. And then what I'll do is for all of these, I'll tell you what the user appreciation of all of these was. User right assignments, we'll talk about that a little more. That's, I think, a very underused feature of Windows. Disabling the sticky keys. I have a disclaimer on the next page about that. And don't go crazy with like device guard, credential guard, and so on early on, because you can shoot yourself in the foot pretty hardcore with that. So disclaimer, don't disable accessibility features without warning people in advance, right? Imagine that you actually relied on sticky keys to get your work done. That would be a pretty douchey move to turn it off. So I was just talking about user right assignments. So the thing with user right assignments in Windows is Microsoft provides a template that you can use, but you need to customize that to your own environment, right? So you've got all these permissions. Log on locally, log on over the network, log on over remote desktop as a batch job, blah, blah, blah. I'm not going to go over all these different settings, but what I will say is your goal should be to make sure that no local credential can be used non-locally, right? So you want to deny logging in over a remote desktop or login, like if it's the local admin, it's got to be interactive. You want to be sure humans have to log in interactively, never as services, jobs, badge jobs, and then the opposite from a service point of view where a service shouldn't be logging in interactively, right? So that takes a little bit of time, but it's worth doing. But then where it gets really interesting with Windows 10 and you can have a great impact for your users and to reduce the amount of crap your SOC has to deal with is with the browsers. So there's pros and cons to Edge and IE. So Edge definitely safer, but IE is more compatible. And if you need Java in your browser, well, it turns out Edge doesn't support Java, which I think is an amazing feature in itself. So has anyone ever used enterprise mode with IE for any reason? So that's a compatibility feature that Microsoft has for websites that are not standards compliant, right? You want to make them run in like IE 10 mode or whatever. So you build a list and you push out that list to your machines. That list can either be in a GPO or it can be in an XML file that you put on a web server. It's just a setting that you turn on. Now, I would highly recommend using the XML because I can't confirm it 100%, but it feels like the GPOs break after 100 sites in the list. But where it gets really interesting is from a security point of view, if you look at what the different modes are for what Microsoft calls a dual browser experience. So you can set Edge as your default browser, you can leave IE, whatever. There's a bunch of different things you can do. But that second bullet there is what I found the most interesting. Use Edge as your primary browser and use the enterprise mode to open sites in IE. So basically what that means is that list that you just push to all of your machines becomes the whitelist of stuff that's allowed to use IE. So the way that works is if you open Edge and you type google.com, you go to Google. If you type terribletimesheetsoftware.internet.com, it sends you to IE where you can have your Java, whatever plugins that you need. And it also works the other way around. If in IE you try to go back to youtube.com, it will send you back to Edge. So it's very seamless for the end users. You got to get over the shock of using Edge, right? For people that are actually used to using Internet Explorer, it can be a little bit jarring in the beginning, but it makes a huge difference. Like the benefit of not having people go to the internet with a browser that's got any plugins on it it's hard to overstate. And to mitigate the shock from end users who they can't stand Edge, it's mostly the UI, right? Like they're not used to it or whatever. Turns out most people actually love third-party browsers like Chrome. So then that was the second thing that we focused on. We said, well, if we're going to force people to use Edge, we probably need to have another option. So people love Chrome. People don't like ads. Security people, we hate ads, right? So we figured we could push out the enterprise version of Chrome, Chrome for Business, I think it's called. It's the same thing. It's just MSI package. And it supports applying all the Chromium and Chrome policies, which there's, I don't know, maybe 100 of them or whatever. A lot of them are interesting, like, prevent people from saving their passwords and so on. But there's a few of them that make a massive difference. Extensions blacklist. If you can, you may want to blacklist everything and then whitelist the extensions that are allowed. That's going to depend on your environment. Then you want to whitelist at least one ad blocker of choice and force the installation of that ad blocker. So that's what extension install force list means. The first time they run Chrome, in every profile, these extensions that you list will get automatically installed. And then there's a setting called default plugin settings. That's basically the click to play or disable plugins and so on. I'd recommend going to click to play. I've done like full, you can't use Flash at all except if it's whitelisted. It's doable, but you need to be in an environment where managing the whitelist is easy and very flexible. So because it's 2018 and Spectre, Meltdown, blah, 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 pretty sure someone was going to ask, what about the flags? You can also do that if you want to enable site per process. You can do that with that same policy. I wouldn't recommend rolling that out to 20,000 machines before testing. So now we're back to a 3-browser strategy. So we've got good old IE for Java, whitelisted websites, and so on. You could also just open it up for your entire intranet. Not sure that's the best idea necessarily. You'll probably have a few external websites that you'll need to whitelist, but you've already reduced the amount of junk that's going to get executed by Java by like 99%. Edge is your default browser for people who don't need more. And then Chrome with ad blocking is what most people who are like power user of browsers end up with. So the user acceptance for this when we rolled it out was very high because people were just really happy that, oh, IT finally officially supports Chrome. That's cool. I get an ad blocker by default. Thank you. It's faster. It's nice. Extension blacklisting is a little hard to manage. People end up using more extensions than I would have expected. There's a lot of stuff that comes with extensions now, right? Like Skype is an extension, WebEx is an extension, blah, blah, blah. So if you have a good whitelist, it's doable. Chrome is going to start blocking some ads in 2 weeks. So that's why I won't push too much on the ad blocker portion, because what I will do in 2 weeks when it becomes part of the main release is I'll look to see if, from a security perspective, the bad ads are filtered out, then we don't even need that extension anymore. And from back when I was a consultant, I would just warn you against suggesting a CISO in a media company to deploy ad blocking on all their workstations. It's kind of awkward. So after we were done with that, we just moved on to Office, right? Like based on the different detections that we see. The thing with Office is there's too many ways you can shoot yourself in the foot with the different settings that they have. So if you ever look at the settings for Office, it's this long per program. So every setting is duplicated for every, like PowerPoint, Excel, and so on. And there's a lot of options that basically let you warn the user and let them proceed. Who will ever click on something that they think they need for work, see a pop-up that says, oh, if you don't click OK, it's going to look messed up, and not click OK? Like, it makes no sense. I never want to see these plugins, so these pop-ups. So we really focused on one setting first. It's just block macros from running in Office, block macros from running in Office files from the internet. That's the name of the setting. So basically using metadata from files that come from an email in Outlook or that come from being downloaded by a browser and so on. You just disable macros on that. Once you're done with that, you can do the standard hardening stuff. You can get more advanced with exploit guard and disabling DDE and so on. But in the numbers I'll share at the end, it's just that first thing. So for that, the end user acceptance there was way more fear than actual pain. So we started bringing in like way more than just the interns, and we had a lot of people really concerned. They thought we were just disabling macros in the entire company. Like, you don't understand. We need macros to work. No. So be sure you communicate that really, really clearly. And then the best way of providing an exception was we just provide a trusted path so that people that really. You'll find a few people in your company that have a legit use for downloading macros from the internet. It's usually like we deal with this like third-party client and like complicated billing stuff, whatever. But it's low. It's single-digit % of users, probably even less. And if you're in a hybrid environment like I am, you'll notice that Office for Mac has almost no setting for managing that. Fortunately, at least it's sandbox, so I can't really say that Office for Mac is a big problem for me right now. But it's far from being as configurable as the Windows one, which there's pros and cons. So if we just go back to that kill chain we were looking at, we didn't really make a big impact on the external recon. That's not what we're trying to do. We did reduce the attack surface of the typical workstation quite a bit, right? Because plugins are gone from browsing to the internet. Macros are gone from the internet. They're really simple settings. When you think about it, that's like changing 10 settings on your entire environment. lateral movement, just blocking 445 inbound, like you're going to say, well, it's not perfect if it's inbound. It doesn't matter. If most machines are not, what you're trying to prevent with this is not necessarily an advanced attacker. You want to prevent like really, really rapid spread of something that maybe managed to get some domain credentials or whatever. So if you can just prevent your workstations from listening there, the lateral movement, you'll make it way harder. Credential compromission, right? Like getting to the point where past the hash is really mitigated in your environment. It requires way more than that, but I think it's not worth getting to that until you've done this. So once I did that, what we did is we let it run on about 4% on our environment. You know, the rest was already like hardened as per, you know, CIS, baselines, and, you know, Microsoft baselines and so on. But the users we specifically targeted with that, it ended up being about 4% of the users for about 2 months. And then we started gathering a lot of data on like, okay, what types of alerts do we get from these? Do we get more false positives or less false positives? What about like the use of admin tools that we sometimes detect that we usually freak out about these because they're real attacks. They use PSExec a lot and different things like that. So unfortunately, I can't just give you the raw data. I really wish I could, but my boss said I couldn't give Reed access to our SIM in that conference, unfortunately. But, so does anyone want to take a guess at how much like off-the-shelf random garbage detections, how much lower is it on systems that have just these few settings applied to them as compared to the rest of the environment? How much? 80%. It's like 78%. It's like 78%. So what we did was we looked at it, we looked at the alerts. They generate 4 times fewer alerts than the standard workstations. And remember, I have more at-risk users in there, right? So it's actually more than that. And so I looked at, it's we're talking about like thousands of alerts and over like 60 days and so on. And it makes a huge difference, right? Like if you have 75,000 computers in your company, anything that'll reduce the alert rate by 75%, that's massive. And in terms of the amount of machines that we do see detections from, it's even lower than that, right? So they generate 1/4 of the average that other machines generate. But, you know, typically you'll see one machine is responsible for, you know, once stuff happens, then it usually leads to more bad things happening, or someone is trying to run something, it doesn't work, and they tried 20 times or whatever. So in terms of their representation per machine in the alerting that we got, it's even lower than that. So it had an amazing impact on what we could focus on, right? Like as we're rolling this out, we're just like dropping the amount of junk that people have to follow up on, and I would say it improved the credibility of our security team by quite a bit, because like for once we're seen as people like helping make things better from the end user's point of view. We didn't break too much stuff, which helps, but you know, we're not done. I'm pretty sure I'm going to break something bad. Always do. And now, so what we're doing is we're looking at what's left after you've done that, right? Because that's definitely a first step. I think you can start rolling that out in like a week on a pilot group. So now we're looking at what's left, right? Having fewer detections, it doesn't mean you're more secure, right? But it means at least like the easy stuff, you've taken care of that, then you can move on to more advanced stuff. So I really want to improve my extensions management process for Chrome. So probably have some automation where people could submit suggestions for extensions to be whitelisted. I had a client where we built an internal app store for Chrome extensions. They had maybe 40, 50. That's a lot of work because they were but that was a really high security environment. I think that with a whitelist of 50 to 70 extensions, that would probably cover everything. So does anyone use OS Query a lot in prod? Well, you probably have access to that data, so you would be able to know what kind of extensions your users are running. So that's what I want to improve. And then I really want to get more hardcore with AppLocker. I want to use it to make it annoying to be a local admin, right? So if you need local admin privileges for a good reason and you get them to, I don't know, you need to install something or whatever, I want to use it to do things like, oh, you can't run Outlook because you got local admin privileges. You can't run IE. You can't run any browser. You can't run Word. Just to make it so annoying that people are going to fall back to their regular account to do regular work. But at the same time, it's a really easy feature to roll out as opposed to doing like full whitelisting, which, we have a highly diverse environment. That Docker, Ubuntu on Windows example from the beginning, I'm not making that up. That's an actual thing. And the next thing I'd like to do is I want to measure the impact of similar changes on Mac. Like all that Chrome stuff, you can do it on Mac via MDM. It's a Chrome profile. The only problem I have is my Mac footprint is much lower than my Windows footprint, so I don't have that much data. So it's a little hard for me to be able to measure that. I got a feeling that the impact would be similar, though probably not as close to the 80%, just because there's not as much on the different Macs. So I realize I'm the only thing sitting between you and lunch. So I think we still have some minutes left for questions. Does anyone have questions on specific settings, stuff that broke?
Thanks. This is great. We have a lot of similar experiences. One of the things that you mentioned, though, is on the local admin and keeping people off of it. After doing a lot of red teaming, we ultimately landed on wanting administrators, like actual support, to use the local admin,
right?
To avoid caching domain passwords locally in LSAS. So what we ended up doing is we roll the passwords that are all unique. So if that one gets exposed, it won't allow lateral movement. What account are you telling people to use when they do remote admin?
So what I mean by local admin, I mean I don't want people doing their day-to-day work with admin privileges. So actually, if you use Labs, and that's a pretty small screenshot, but what's really interesting is we found a way where we could solve a lot of like the privilege elevation issues we had without third-party software by allowing people to get their local admin credentials, right? Like you request them, and then it's going to extract the value from AD and give it to them. And you can set it to get rolled like every 7 days or whatever, so they won't have it forever. And then that way, like it's not going to be like a powerful IT account in memory that can connect to 15,000 workstations. So
what I mean in particular, I thought I saw something on here where you were not allowing it to be used for RDP.
Yeah.
So the end user self-supporting, that's one thing, but for IT to support people, what's the blessed correct account for them to use?
Well, I guess if you're using RDP, then you got to be careful with that. But you definitely would still want to be able to block, deny, login from the network, right? Because RDP, you don't really see like ransomware spreading through RDP. WMI, PSExec, that kind of stuff you typically do. So you could allow it for RDP with the creds in AD through Labs, and that would still get you like 90% of the benefit, I think. We don't use RDP for support, so I didn't really have to think about that. Thanks.
Hey, so I had a question about how you're dealing with PowerShell. For example, you didn't really go into depth there, but I'm curious about protective controls or detective controls, how you see that because the attacks from PowerShell are obviously evolving and pretty common. So, I'm sort of curious if you have any strategies around how you would deal with that.
So for now, it's more about visibility. I think we're expanding the amount of PowerShell logging that we do, and we're like whenever we see something, we improve our detection mechanisms for that. You can't really go and like disable PowerShell, right? Like it's not really a thing you want to do because it's also really useful. The main problem that I found with PowerShell, the thing that still I have a hard time reducing false positives on is systems management tools that leverage PowerShell and do things like, oh, I'm going to base 64 this 50,000 foot long command. That looks really close to a lot of malware that I've seen. So I still like, my blood pressure goes up a little bit. So it's just more logging and more visibility for now. PowerShell execution policies, obviously not a super useful thing, so easy to bypass.
Okay, yeah, I would talk more with you about that after, because there's a good control you can put in, which is preventing downgrade of PowerShell versions.
Okay.
Because in version 5 and up, they increase the logging
totally.
tremendously.
A big difference.
So if you can basically say, don't allow somebody to downgrade to pre 5.0, Because
Yeah.
what they'll do is they'll use a pre 5.0 PowerShell, and then you have less logging or less visibility.
Yeah, I was thinking of trying to use App Locker for that kind of stuff, where you whitelist the PowerShell executables for the latest versions and maybe block it from the standard user or something like that. So we'll see what we can do about that. Oops, sorry about that. Punch the mic. Can't drop it. It's fixed.
For our high-level servers, we've been exploring the idea of like a combination lock approach where you disable, exe running, PowerShell running, and you have, and when you need to enable it, we have some sort of script or secret spot where we can go back and enable it, run what we need to do, and then go back and disable it. So 99% of the time, it is disabled.
Yeah.
But I was thinking I can't help. Our hardening list isn't as extensive as 1,000 pages, as it was brought up earlier ago. But have you seen clients explore firewall a little more, specifically on the host machine?
Yeah.
And I can't help but think that would help prevent some types of lateral movement if it was really locked down. Or I think it's underutilized quite a bit.
Yeah. Well, you can lock it down a lot, but I think if you just start with blocking inbound 445 from everything except like your SCCM server or whatever, that's already like a lot of the benefit. I've had quite a few clients now where we rolled out host-based firewalls, either like the operating systems or third party, and there's not a whole, like in a corporate environment, there's not a whole lot of reasons why you need machines to talk to one another. Like the exceptions are pretty easy to find in most companies. Like you'll always have like some voice over IP app or something that's peer-to-peer. If you have a lot of remote offices, maybe you have like a branch cache or something like that for performance reasons. But it makes a huge difference. And I think, when I was at Rapid7, I would see the pen testers like starting to swear when they were testing a client that had a lot of host-based firewalls. So I completely agree with you that it's underutilized.
Anybody else?
All right, thank you.
Awesome, thank you.
Have a great lunch.
We are at lunch until 1 o'clock.